the question beneath the question remains the same.
So, Anna Kendrick's directorial debut, Woman of the Hour, tackles a story that simply seems too wild to be true, but is, unfortunately, based on real events. The film stars Kendrick as Cheryl, a character modeled closely after a 28-year-old woman named Cheryl Bradshaw, who appeared on the popular TV show in 1978. Long before Love Island hit screens, there was The Dating Game. This classic show, which originally ran from 1965, had a pretty straightforward setup featuring a wholesome-looking bachelorette who would ask a series of light-hearted, pre-written questions to three hidden bachelors, all dressed in their best polyester suits. The bachelorette made her decision based on these flirty questions full of cheesy double entendres, and after she chose one of the guys, the two would head off on a supposedly all-expenses-paid romantic vacation, always with a chaperone in tow, of course. Now, a certain 1978 episode of The Dating Game gained infamy years later when it was revealed that one of the bachelors, Rodney Alcala, wasn't just the successful photographer he claimed to be. At the time of his appearance, he had already served 2 prison sentences for molesting 2 young girls, one of whom was only 8 years old. What is worse is that police didn't yet know that Alcala had also raped and murdered 5 women in the months leading up to the show. Despite his horrific past, Alcala came across as charming and smart, fooling everyone, including contestant Cheryl Bradshaw, who chose him as her date. Sadly, what Bradshaw didn't know when she picked Rodney Alcala was that he was far from just another eligible bachelor, but in fact, he was a convicted sex offender and a serial killer. This unsettling story had already inspired one film before, and now Anna Kendrick revisited the dating game killer with Woman of the Hour. In the wake of the #MeToo movement, Kendrick's version focuses heavily on how repeated failures by law enforcement, mainly from not taking allegations seriously or pursuing leads with enough urgency, let Rodney Alcala slip through the cracks time and time again. It's now believed he may have killed over 100 women girls. Through the film's entire runtime, Kendrick actually builds an atmosphere of fear and dread without explicitly showing the sexual violence, instead giving the victims their dignity and humanity. In this video, we explored the thin line between fact and fiction in this chilling true crime story. So, without wasting another moment, let's get right to it. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Was Cheryl Bradshaw really an aspiring actress? In Woman of the Hour, Cheryl Bradshaw, with an S for the fictionalized version, is portrayed as a serious actress who has done theater work before in New York, but moved to Los Angeles in hopes of breaking into the film industry. However, it is her refusal to do nude scenes and her preference for intellectual roles over sexy ones that limited her opportunities. When she is on the verge of giving up and moving back to New York, her agent lands her a spot on The Dating Game by telling her it will get her noticed. But when the episode doesn't lead her to get any big break, Cheryl follows through with her plan and packs up her life to head back to New York. Now, in reality, not much is known about the real Cheryl Bradshaw with a C. On her Dating Game episode, she was introduced as someone with a wealth of experience, and just like in the film, it was also mentioned that she once worked as a former foot masseuse. At the time, she introduced herself as a drama teacher living in Phoenix, but there's no evidence that she was ever an actress in New York or LA. Interestingly, there is documentation of one Cheryl Bradshaw who taught communications at a community college in Avondale, Arizona, and passed away in 2004. But it is unclear if she was the same person who appeared on the game show or had an ill-fated rendezvous with a serial killer. Did Cheryl Bradshaw decline a date with Rodney Alcala after The Dating Game? So, in the film, we saw how impressed Cheryl was by Rodney Alcala's answers, which seemed very respectful at the time when being compared to the other 2 bachelors, or Lutnugs, as the show's makeup artist likes to call them. After Cheryl chose Bachelor number 3 and the show ended, she headed to a tiki bar with Rodney Alcala for drinks, but things quickly get uncomfortable when Alcala starts to show subtle signs of creepiness. creepiness and insists on ordering another round even after she declines. Cheryl discreetly signals the waitress, who steps in to help by telling Rodney that the bar is closing. The situation becomes even more unsettling when Alcala follows her to her car after realizing she gave him a fake phone number in order to make sure he can't reach her again in the future. I mean, he pretty much ran up to her car when she tried to make a quick escape, and if it were not for the workers of the studio leaving after their shift, this woman would have been toast too. At the end of the episode, Cheryl later tells the show's liaison she doesn't want to go on anywhere with him before leaving LA altogether. This is mostly true, though it's unlikely that the real Bradshaw went for drinks with Alcala right after the taping. However, she was definitely creeped out by it. According to the show's contestant coordinator, Ellen Metzger, Bradshaw told her that she felt weird vibes coming off him. He behaved very strangely, and that made Cheryl super uncomfortable. When she asked Elle if that was going to be a problem, the contestant coordinator shared this information with ABC's 2020, adding that the production team had no issue with Bradshaw backing out of the date. Also, while the woman of the house shows a romantic trip to Carmel as the prize, in reality, the actual reward was a much less glamorous outing to Magic Mountain theme park. Did Bachelor number 2 really warn Cheryl Bradshaw about Rodney Alcala? In the movie, Bachelor number 2, Jed Mills, is portrayed as a smooth-talking guy who considers himself to be a bit of a ladies' man, strictly believing in the treat him mean, keep him keen philosophy. Well, let's just say today's women would hate him at first introduction, because he does come off as one of those self-absorbed jerks who don't respect anyone around them. I mean, he literally says any woman below a C cup size is useless, and that if Cheryl turned out to be anything less, he would let her blow it. Naturally, he and Rodney end up in an off-mic rivalry over who Cheryl will choose, and it was Rodney who ended the argument confidently by boasting about how he always gets the girl. After the show, when the losing bachelors give Cheryl a quick kiss on the cheek before leaving, Bachelor number 2 takes the opportunity to lean in and quietly warns her about the guy she just picked, calling him an asshole. Now, of course, we cannot be sure if Mills actually whispered a similar warning to Bradshaw in real life, but later did admit about having serious concerns about Alcala by calling him a very creepy man during an interview. In fact, he even remembered being with Alcala in the green room while the serial killer was flexing about how he always gets his girls. Mills provided this information in a CNN interview in March 2010 while describing why he felt an instinctive dislike for Rodney. Jed Mills had also pointed out how there was something about the guy that repulsed him. He went on to describe Alcala as a very strange guy with some really bizarre opinions. Was Rodney Alcala truly a serial killer, as depicted in Woman of the Hour? Yes, Rodney Alcala, who was born in Texas, was finally apprehended in 1979 and later convicted of murder. Alcala's ill-fated appearance on The Dating Game in 1978 came just 4 years after his release from prison for the first time, where he had served 34 months for child molestation after kidnapping and sexually assaulting an 8-year-old girl in 1968. In the time between that crime and his arrest, he had already killed at least one woman, though he wouldn't be prosecuted for that murder until decades later when DNA advancements linked him to a string of cold cases. Tragically, he went on to murder at least 4 more women before he became Bachelor number 1. Luckily, a good Samaritan saw the 8-year-old girl getting into a car with a man she didn't seem to know, and after trailing them to an apartment building, the witness called the police, who arrived and found the child alive on the evening of September 25, 1968. They also discovered Alcala's UCLA student ID at the scene, which gave them a suspect right away. However, Alcala, who at that time was a 25-year-old Army veteran, had gone AWOL and had been diagnosed with severe antisocial personality disorder by a military psychiatrist before attending college, was long gone before the police could get him. During his decade-long spree, he's believed to have assaulted hundreds of people and possibly killed over 130 of his victims. Alcala was arrested in July 1979 after the police discovered a pair of earrings belonging to one of his victims in a storage locker that he had rented in Seattle. After a very long and grueling court battle, he was sentenced to death, but Rodney actually died of natural causes at the age of 77 in 2021. Did Rodney Alcala study film at NYU under Roman Polanski? Woman of the Hour takes us to 1971 in New York, where a young woman is busy renovating her loft-style apartment. When her movers leave her furniture on the street because she didn't pay enough to have it brought upstairs, she notices Rodney across the street, taking pictures of her predicament. So she takes advantage of this situation and asks him to help her in moving her things up. Once they were inside, she offered him a beer to show her gratitude. Eventually, they start chatting about contemporary films and discover they both share a love for art house cinema, which Rodney discusses with impressive knowledge. He then mentions that he attended NYU and took a film class taught by Roman Polanski. Alcala pretty much captivates all his women by claiming to be a professional photographer who recognizes their beauty. Naturally, feeling charmed by his intelligence and sophistication, the woman lets her guard down, only for Rodney to suddenly pounce and strangle her with a scarf. Now, in the real version of these events, Alcala's second known victim was a 23-year-old TWA flight attendant named Cornelia Crilly. Tragically, he strangled her with a stocking shortly after she moved into her new apartment. According to Stella Sands' 2011 book, The Dating Game Killer, the true story of a TV dating show, a violent sociopath, and a series of brutal murders, Alcala had resurfaced in New York under the name John Berger. Using that alias, he enrolled at NYU, graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1971 at the age of 27, worked as a photographer, and even got a job as a counselor at an arts and drama camp in New Hampshire. So, under the same John Berger alias, Rodney got a fine arts degree from UCLA before attending NYU. It was at UCLA where he took a film class taught by Roman Polanski. Alcala had an unsettling obsession with photography, particularly capturing images of his victims before, during, and after their assaults. This creepy predator-like behavior reminds me of the character in Powell and Pressburger's Peeping Tom, who uses a tripod with a dagger to film the last moments of his victims. Although some people say that while he did enroll at NYU, he never finished his studies, and there's no hardcore evidence he actually crossed paths with Polanski, who was already a well-known director by that time, famous for films like Rosemary's Baby. During the late 60s and early 70s, Alcala was on the run from the crimes he committed in California, which is what led him to take an alias and move to New York. How did Rodney Alcala end up on The Dating Game in 1978? So, Alcala managed to appear on The Dating Game by simply applying to be one of the free bachelors featured in each episode. It was the 70s, and of course, the show did not care enough to conduct thorough background checks on the participants, so it's possible that the producers were unaware of his vicious criminal history. As depicted in Woman of the Hour, on The Dating Game 2, Alcala was introduced by the host as a photographer who enjoyed skydiving and motorcycling in his spare time, sporting long hair and a gap-toothed smile. Luckily, the real-life Cheryl Bradshaw felt something off about the guy right from the moment she met him, and it was that intuition which saved her life. Did Cheryl Bradshaw choose her own questions for the Bachelors on The Dating Game? In the film, we see how Sheryl gets disgusted by the problematic questions given to her by the producers, and she decides to show who she really is by winging her own questions, when the hairdresser and makeup artist boosts her confidence. So she takes a pen and brings in her A-game with questions that leave the Bachelors in question quite baffled. Sadly, nothing of that sort happened in real life, as the real Bradshaw read out the questionnaire given to her by the production itself. Everything she asked in the show was scripted and pre-written. So, Anna Kendrick chose to have her character Sheryl break the usual dating game mold by ignoring the silly and often sexist questions that bachelorettes are expected to ask. Instead, she posed smart questions that revealed the men's lack of intelligence, except for Alcala, whose entire personality was said to be charming, which, always made him stand out. This was a clever way for Anna to demonstrate how Sheryl was seizing the opportunity to challenge that sexist culture. Ironically though, it ultimately puts her in a more dangerous situation when she chose Rodney because of his perfect answers. Was Rodney Alcala's arrest linked to a teenage runaway? In the film, Rodney, who's always seen with an expensive viewfinder camera hanging around his neck, lures a teenage runaway into his car by pretending to be a model scout. He shows her fashion photos of other women that he claims to have discovered. But this girl isn't completely naive because she's a survivor. We see her break into a laundry machine for coins, and she even questions Rodney carefully before agreeing to get into his car. As they drive toward the desert, he tries to get her to relax relax by asking about her family, but she flips the script and starts asking him questions too. Despite this back and forth that seems to create a bond, he suddenly knocks her to the ground while she poses with her back to him, facing the setting sun. When she wakes up the next morning, she finds herself covered in bruises and abrasions. She even had her hands and legs tied while her pants were wrapped around her ankles. But instead of screaming or trying to free herself in the middle of nowhere, this girl uses her brain and scoots towards Rodney, who was laying beside her and crying. She even asked him if he was okay, and Rodney, sensing her vulnerability, asks if he was too rough. She simply plays along, saying she actually likes it that way, but asks him to keep what happened a secret so others won't judge her. And then she suggests they go back to his place to continue what they started. Receiving a different reaction from one of his victims made Rodney feel a false sense of security, which is what makes him decide not to kill her off like all his other victims. And so, he drives her back towards LA. When they stop at a gas station, Rodney steps away to use the restroom, giving her the perfect chance to slip out unnoticed and head toward a diner where she can call for help. As she watches from a distance, Rodney comes out to the sound of police sirens before getting handcuffed and pitted to the ground, which brings her a calming satisfaction. Later, the title at the end of the film reveals that it was her testimony at his trial, which played a significant role in securing his conviction. Now, it is true that in 1979, Alcala picked up a 15-year-old runaway who he raped and nearly strangled, which, as you know, is Alcala's classic MO, as shown in the film, where he reveled in nearly strangling all his victims, resuscitating them and then raping and torturing them again. In real life, this teenage girl was Monique Hoyt, whom Alcala picked up hitchhiking. After he raped her, she did manage to escape his clutches by convincing him she wanted to continue the relationship, and was then able to raise the alarm. Although the police attended to her complaint, unfortunately, they didn't arrive in time to arrest Alcala. Hoyt did testify, but not until 2010, at a trial to determine whether Alcala should get the death penalty for the rape and murder of 4 women and a 12-year-old girl. He had previously been assigned to death row for these crimes, but he had the penalty overturned on technicalities. Far from being collected right after her attack, even 31 years later, Hoyt was so unnerved by the prospect of seeing Alcala again that she needed an LAPD detective to sit with her in the courtroom, where she told the jury that Rodney Alcala had ruined her life. Did Rodney Alcala really work as a photographer for the Los Angeles Times? About a year after his appearance on The Dating Game in Woman of the Hour, Rodney strikes up a conversation with a young, naive copy boy at the Los Angeles Times, claiming to be a photographer for the paper. As the boy wanders around the editorial floor, he sees Rodney entertaining a group of his male colleagues by boasting about how his fashion gigs give him access to beautiful women. The men are captivated by the risque photos Rodney has laid out on a table, and even asks about how he even has the permission to photograph such young girls. To which Rodney responds that a 13-year-old parents gave him the permission to click any sort of photos he wanted of his daughter in exchange for money. Just then, the police show up to question him, but somehow, Rodney manages to charm them as well. Meanwhile, his co-workers exchange whispers about him behind his back. While some expressed admiration, others were clearly feeling uneasy. Now, in the real-life version of these events, Rodney Alcala actually did have a job at the LA Times in 1979, where he was working as a typesetter, not a photographer. However, he did get gigs as a wedding photographer, and many of his clients were completely unaware of his past as a registered sex offender, just like the producers of The Dating Game. So, in Woman of the Hour, Anna Kendrick portrays Alcala in a way that is much more somber and unappealing compared to the real-life Alcala, who was known for being confident, handsome, charming, and an absolute crowd pleaser. This creative choice is likely aimed to avoid glamorizing a serial killer, but it does make it harder to understand how the real Alcala managed to convince so many women to pose for him. Did a victim's friend in The Dating Game audience recognize Rodney Alcala as a killer? In the film, we see a woman in the audience experience a panic attack when she spots Rodney and immediately recognizes him as the man who had approached her and her friend on the beach just a day before her friend was found raped and murdered in her apartment. When her boyfriend tries to gaslight her into thinking she might be getting her facts wrong, she simply asks him to leave. Desperate to get help, the woman tells a security guard that she needs to speak with the show's show's producer immediately, and the guard asks her to wait in an office, assuring her that someone will be with her soon. Unfortunately, no one comes to help, and eventually, only a custodian shows up. Later, when she forgives her boyfriend and reconciles with him, he drives her to the police station where she tries to report her concerns to the police, and, well, unfortunately, they brush her off as well, leaving her feeling unheard and helpless. Kendrick shared in an interview that this particular woman's character is a composite and was designed to symbolize all the people who tried to report Rodney Alcala over the years but were ignored. She also stood as a metaphor for the many leads that went cold simply because the police were not dedicated enough to connect the dots. For instance, the case of Cornelia Crilly went unsolved for 40 years. After her murder, Alcala moved away from New York and took a job as a counselor at an arts camp for girls. And it was not until 2 campers spotted his photo on the FBI's 10 most wanted list during a trip to the local post office that the police finally caught up with him. When California police wanted to charge him for murdering an 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro after beating and raping her with a metal bar, her family had unfortunately left the country. With no main witnesses left, prosecutors had to offer Rodney Alcala a deal if he pled guilty to the lesser charge of child molestation. The judge gave Alcala a sentence of a mere 1 year to life, and he was paroled. Sadly, the serial killer and rapist was back on the street after only 34 months of committing such a horrendous crime. So that was everything you needed to know about the differences between the serial killer we saw in Woman of the Hour and the real Rodney Alcala that terrorized hundreds of women in the 70s. With that being said, have you seen the film yet? What do you think of Anna Kendrick's take on the dating game serial killer in her directorial debut? Let us know about your thoughts and opinions in the comment box below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.